In this video, I'm going to walk through the PLAID ColBERTv2 scoring pipeline using the RAGatouille library that gives me access to the ColBER repo, which is the codebase associated with the research paper. Here's a screenshot of the four-stage PLAID scoring pipeline. I'm not going to go into the details of PLAID right now, other than showing the code. I'll make a separate video where I'm going through the actual paper and talking about some of the concepts there. But one thing I do want to stress, which is the really kind of innovative part of PLAID, is that it uses the interaction between centroids and query token vectors as long as it can in the pipeline until we actually deal with the passage token vectors. And these centroids are from clusters of passage tokens that happen at the start of the indexing process. And these centroids are shown to capture semantically enough meaning that the passage tokens represent. And so you'll see in stage 1, stage 2, and stage 3, we're dealing with these centroid scores. And there's fewer centroids than there are passage token embeddings usually. In this example, I have a toy example where that's not the case, but usually we'll have hundreds, maybe thousands, even more documents. Each document has hundreds or thousands of tokens, so the number of tokens can get quite large, whereas the number of centroids is an order of magnitude or more smaller. So that's about all I'm going to say in terms of setting the stage for PLAID. Again, I plan on releasing a video on PLAID as a paper summary, but hopefully going through the code will help you kind of capture the main elements of that paper. So I'm going to start by loading up RAGatouille, and I'm going to use ColBERTv2 as my model, and I'm going to use RAGatouille to give me my ground truth results. And to do so, I first need a query. So I'm going to start with what is Python. That's going to be my query. And then I have 3 documents. I'm just going to copy them over. And in these documents, we see that this first one is the correct answer, or it's the closest answer, or most relevant answer. This one here is not the one we're looking for, but it's still Python related, so I consider that a hard negative. And then this one here is still related to programming, but it's not about Python, so that's a relatively easier negative. The key thing that I found was important was the index path. So I'm going to load that up, and I'm just going to give it whatever name. Let's call it toy example. And then I'm going to give it my 3 documents. And let's do that. So a couple of things I want to note in this output is that there are 39 embeddings. So there are 39 passage tokens in total. And here we have 13 passage tokens per passage. And we have a total number of 3 passages. So these are some numbers that'll come up again later on. Okay, I'm going to take a look at the index path. And so here is toy example. And this is something we'll look at later on. There are a number of files inside this index path that are really interesting and shed some light onto what some of the concepts actually look like in code from the paper. All right, so I have my index ready. So I'm now going to search my documents for my query of what is Python. A couple of other things that we'll see later on. We're going to see the codec, the IVF, and we're going to see doclens. And let me actually run this again so it reduces some of the output. Cool. So here are my 3 results. And the passage that I thought was the most relevant and is the most relevant. It has a score of 27.6875, and the passage ID is 0. The third passage, which is this one, passage ID of 2, is also related to Python, so it's the second highest ranked at 22.2815, And then the third passage, or the second passage rather, passage ID 1, is the least related to Python, and it has a score of 13.953125. So these scores are very important because this is going to be our ground truth. So throughout this code walkthrough, I'm going to be at each stage, comparing, am I getting these scores, or am I getting close to these scores? And our goal is, by the end of the 4-stage scoring pipeline, we will be able to recreate these scores exactly. And when I was able to do that, a really awesome feeling, because now, I can see the code, I can touch these tensors, and I can really understand these abstract concepts more concretely. Okay, so we will refer back to these results throughout the notebook. So where to start? And this was a bit of just trying things out. I wasn't really sure where to start. I had spent a few hours looking at the code base, and so I had some sense of where things were located. But I was just kind of poking around, and I didn't have really good reasons to poke around where I did, other than, oh, this looks interesting, or oh, this looks like this is going to lead me to the scoring pipeline code. And so I'm going to set up a couple of things that helped me lead into this process. So we're going to take a look at the model, and this is indeed a Colbert model. And then we're going to take a look at the model index. And this is of type PLAID model index. And so that was really key, because that led me to the RAGatouille library, and that led me to the PLAID model index. And as I was looking through the different methods, it seemed like this searcher was of interest, because here in the search method, I'm like, okay, I don't really know what's going on here, but there's, oh, okay, here we go. Here's the query, here's some passage IDs. So it seemed like something in this searcher space was promising. And so let me go back here, and we're going to see that the searcher is accessed through the index. And here we have, it's a Colbert class called searcher. Now, I couldn't find this class in RAGatouille directly, so I had to import Colbert, but RAGatouille installs Colbert as part of its requirements, so that made it a lot easier for me to navigate this code base. So I can access colbert.searcher, and here we see that we have the searcher class, and it takes as a required argument, it takes the index. And I have that, so I'm going to go ahead and build my searcher. Cool. So now I have my searcher. So I'm going to now go to the Colbert repo. So this is the Stanford Feature Data organization under which the Colbert repo exists. And we're going to start looking in here, what is going to help us, get to the bottom of this. So going back to RAGatouille real quick, I have the search method, and this is saying searcher.search. And I give it a query, a top K value, and then I give it passage IDs, if I do have passage IDs, which defaults to none, which I'm not going to have in my initial search. So searcher.search is where I want to look at next. So if I scroll through here, here is searcher.search. And the first thing that we do is we encode our text into Q. So that's going to be our queries. So that's the first thing I'm going to do as well. And this should be lowercase. And let's run it again so we don't get all the output. Okay, cool. So this is a good start, right? So I have batch size of 1, and it seems to have defaulted to 32 tokens. And each token is now encoded into 128 dimensions. So what I've kind of stumbled upon here is these are the query token vectors that they talk about in the paper. So that was very exciting to see, and that kind of set the stage for the next steps that follow. All right, so let's go back to Searcher. I encode my queries, and then comes an interesting part. Then it leads me down to dense search. So I'm just going to scroll down here. And dense search then brings us down to the ranker.rank. And it seems like rank is really the function that does all the heavy lifting to get us the passage IDs and the scores for those passage IDs. So let's take a look at each one of those. So here's searcher.denseSearch. And yes, I do indeed have access to that. And then I'm going to take that and I'm going to pass it my encoded query tokens. And here we go. We get some output. And if we look back at dense search, it has up to the top k values of the passage IDs, a list of k values, and then up to the top k values of the scores. So here I'm getting a passage ID of 0. I'm getting my k values, which are 1 through 10. And then I'm getting 27.6875. And if you recall, if we look at our topmost result from RAGatouille, we see that we have 27.685. So I'm like, okay, cool. This is promising. This is exciting. We're getting numbers that match what we're supposed to expect. But the problem here is I'm only getting one value, right? And I wanted to get all 3 of my results. So I went back and I was looking in dense search and I looked at all these if statements, and it seems like if k is less than 10 or less than or equal to 10, which it is, I didn't specify k, I just gave it I let the default value go. And if self.config.ncels is none, then it configures the ncels value to be 1. And then it also sets the threshold and ndocs, both things that we'll see later on. So I think this ncels value of 1 is what is causing me to get only one value back. But we'll get to that in a second. What I want to do now is I want to look at this searcher.rank. So I want to look at this value here, or this method right here. So I have my searcher, and then I should be able to access .ranker.rank, and I can. And this is of class index scorer, which if we scroll up to our searcher, we'll see, actually I think it's, let's see, index scorer. And yeah, so our ranker is of class index scorer. So that's what we're seeing. That's what we're seeing here, index scorer.rank. And so one of the things that I'm interested in is I want to figure out, what is this configuration which is causing my ncels value to be set. So if I look at searcher.config, and more specifically, if I look at searcher.config.ncels, I'll see that that value has been set to 1. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set that value to 4, which is one of the values that they use in the paper. And for context, what they're calling ncels in the codebase is called nprobe in the PLAID paper. And it represents the number of centroids near the query tokens. So I'm going to set my ncels to equal 4. And just confirming that it is in fact 4. And so now I'm going to go back down here and I'm going to manually call ranker.rank. I'm going to give it my config, my queries, and I don't have my PIDs yet, so it should give me back the actual PIDs. Okay, so now we are cooking, because if I look at my results from RAGatouille, my first ranked passage is passage ID 0, which is 0 here, and 27.6875, which is this value here, and I can see the other two are correct, right? So here's passage ID 2, 22.28125, which is here, and then the third one is 13.953125, and that is passage ID 1. So this lets me know that, okay, I may not know exactly how the code base is configured, but I'm letting this result match guide my entire process. Okay, so this is good. And at this point, I felt like, okay, now I can dig deeper into this searcher.ranker.rank method and start picking it apart to see, how we can do stages 1 through 4. So I'm going to now look at the methods. Let me go here, and this is rank. And if we see rank, it's defined in index storage, which is this file open here. And if I go back to the top, and let's look at rank. So here's rank, here's the config, here's the queries, query tokens queue, and PIDs is none, right? I did not pass it any passage IDs because this was my initial search. So PIDs is none, so that means this line is going to run. And what this line does is that it uses the method retrieve for the ranker, and then it passes the config and the queue. So I'm like, okay, that's cool. Let's go to retrieve, which is in this file, just a few lines up. So here is retrieve. And I can see that retrieve is taking the config and queries, and then it's indexing into it with the query max length, which I think is 32. And then it's passing on that config and that tensor with my query token vectors. It's passing it on to generate candidates. And at that point, I'm like, well, first of all, thank you for naming that method generate candidates, because that's confirming that we are actually now generating our passage ID candidates. So it passes config and queue to generate candidates, and I get back my passage IDs and Centroid scores. So this looks, super promising. And the next step that I'm going to do is I'm just going to go back here, and I'm going to make sure that I do have access to these things. So here is retrieve, and that is good. And then I'm basically going to call, maybe go back down to rank. Here's rank. So basically I'm going to call this line and see if what I get back for PIDs and Centroid scores. So this was another kind of inflection point for me because, great, we're getting our PIDs back. And then now we're also getting back this Centroid scores, which is a matrix, and it has 64 rows and 32 columns. And the 32 I recognize because that's the number of query tokens. And so this made me think back to section 4.1, where they talk about, given the query embedding matrix Q, and the list of Centroid vectors C in the index, PLAID computes the token level query Centroid relevance scores as a matrix multiplication. And so here we have our Centroids, and then here we have the transpose of our query tokens. So at this point, I'm like, okay, I'm pretty sure this 32 corresponds to the number of query tokens. And I'm pretty sure that this 64 represents the Centroid IDs. So it seems like we're dealing with 64 Centroids here. So we'll take a look at that and we'll confirm that in a little bit, but I want to keep moving down into this code. So we did retrieve and we got back our passage IDs and Centroid scores, but I want to dig deeper now into retrieve and go to generate candidates, which is also in this file. Actually, sorry, no, generate candidates is in the candidate generation.py file. So inside generate candidates, we have our config and we have our queries. We get our number of cells, our n cells. This is the number of centroids that we want to look for near our tokens, our query tokens. This is interesting. We're going to see this in a little bit. I think stage 2 and 3 will get some experience looking at a strided tensor. I'm not going to go as in depth in this video, but I might do a second video on that. This is cool. I mean, it's very important. We have to do this, so I'll make sure I do this. So let me actually do that first. So this should remove my unit axis, and it does. And then I'm going to make sure that I use the right floating point precision, which it does. And okay, so now we get to this point. So inside of generate candidates is generate candidates PIDs, and we give it our query tokens and we give it the n cells value. So I'm going to hop to that, which is right up here, and we give it our query and n cells, and we go to get cells. So as you can see, this is pretty much what I did, just clicking through the GitHub symbols and finding my way through the code base. And get cells is where we finally see something that's recognizable, which is, and I should probably have zoomed in, but I can finally see something that's recognizable. I have centroids, matrix multiplied with query transpose, and that's exactly what I have in the paper. So I'm like, okay, this is cool. This is working. So let's take a look at what we get here. So let me go back down and just recap that we had generate candidates. That's what we started with. So I want to make sure that each step of the way I can recreate these steps. All right, so there's generate candidates. And I'm going to get back cells and scores. So it gives me back 3 cells, and again I'm seeing this 64 by 32. So if we go here, that's what I'm doing with generate candidates. So it's PIDs and centroid scores. That's what's getting returned. And then I should name this PIDs because that's what they name it. And those are the PIDs that I'm dealing with, right? 0, 1, 2. Okay, one more thing that I want to do is in generate candidate IDs, I want to see if I can recreate that step. So I'm going to copy, well, before we copy, let's look at the code. So generate candidate PIDs is going to take Q and N cells, and my N cells is going to be 4, and then it's going to return my PIDs and scores. So I'm going to copy this. And it's going to take Q and N cells. And here it's interesting that here we have 10, and then we have our 64 by 32. And if we look at the 10 PIDs, we'll see that there's a repeat of some of them. And we're going to look at this in a second. I'm not going to go into it quite yet, but I just want to note that here we're getting, greater than 3 number of passage IDs back. All right, so we're up to generate candidate PIDs. And inside there, now I'm really curious about get cells. So let's scroll up to that. And so this is telling me that I should have access to the centroids. So I'm going to do that first because I'm really curious to see what that looks like. So I'm going to do searcher.ranker.codec.centroids, and we're just going to look at the shape. Good. So now this confirms that, yes, that 64 is indeed the number of centroids that we're dealing with. And each of these centroids have 128 dimensions. And if I look at this next line, so I'm going to call it underscore scores. I'm going to take my centroids and I'm going to do a matrix multiplication with query transposed. And this is codec. And this gives me the 64 by 32. And let's just make sure that that is indeed equal to the other scores that we were getting. And it is, right? So it's averaging true everywhere in this comparison. So this was really neat, right? So I'm literally seeing equation 2 in code, and it's giving me the right result. All right, so let's go back to this one here. So, okay, so centroids at query transpose. So this gives me my scores. Cells is not 1, it's 4. And so then it runs this following line. So I'm going to take a look at that. And let's just grab this. So here what it's doing is it's looking at my scores. It's taking the top k values, and it's going to take the searcher.config.endcells values. It's taking the top k across the rows, and then I'm grabbing the indices for that. So what I'm going to do first is let me just look at my scores and print them out. Okay, cool. So here are my scores. Let's do this. Let's look at the values of this first. And let's do this. Okay, cool. So I can see 1, 2, 3, and 4. So there are 4 tensors. And then I'm assuming here that each one has 32 values, but let's just double check. Yeah, so that's 4 by 32. Okay. And then let me just double check something here. I wanted to recreate something. Give me one sec. Okay, I'll do that in a second. Okay, so yeah, so this gives me the top 4 centroids that are associated with each of my 32 query tokens. So I'm going to go back and I'm going to grab this line of code again. So these are the values, but I'm interested in indices. And again, this goes back to the innovation of PLAID, which is that it's dealing with centroid indices, centroid IDs, as long as it can to minimize how much you're storing along the way. All right, so these are my cells. And so cells is, I guess, a synonym for centroid indices. And they permute this, which is why this is 4 by 32, and then this is 32 by 4. And then the next line is going to flatten this. So this should now be 128. So 4 times 32 is 128. So now we have flattened our top 4 Centroid IDs for each of the 32 query tokens. And then I think the last thing they do is they just run this. So they get the unique IDs. And we get 10, and let's look at them. So these are the 10 Centroid IDs. So 7 is the minimum and 61 is the largest Centroid ID. And if you recall earlier up here, our passage IDs, there were 10 of them. And so we're starting to see the mapping between Centroid IDs and passage IDs. The last thing I want to do before I move on is I want to make sure I understand where these values come from. So I'm going to do, and by these values I mean the scores. So I'm going to take the first centroid of interest, so I'm just going to take this index. So that's the index 7. And then I'm going to take my first query token, transpose it, and take the dot product. So I'm taking the dot product between the 7th centroid and my first token. And let's run this again. And so this is 0.5786. And if we go back here, when we took our top K scores, our top 4 scores, that was the first value. So what I'm interpreting from that is that this tensor corresponds to the 7th centroid, and then this value here corresponds to the first token. And actually that's not correct, because there's only 4. These are the top 4. So I don't think it's not this entire thing that's the 7th token, the 7th centroid. Just this first element represents that. So if we look at, let me run this again. So before we take the unique values, yeah, we can see that, okay, the first value corresponds to 7. The second one is 29. So let's play around with that a little bit. I haven't done this before, so I probably shouldn't experiment too much while we're doing this live. But we have 5361, and let's do query number 1 instead, or index 1. And we get 3887. So yeah, I'm not 100% sure how these map. And let me just do all of these, and let's take a look at okay. I won't dig too deeper because I haven't prepped that. But at least we can show that this one here, this 7th centroid, gives me 0.5786, and that matches here. If you are watching and in the comments you have a suggestion on what I'm missing here to get this value, please do comment there. Okay, so this has so far, and let me run this again. So we have 10. Yeah. And let's run this, which should be, yeah, okay, cool. So now what we have done is we've basically recreated our get cells. And if you recall, get cells was what was called in generate candidate PIDs. So we are basically at this point where we have our scores and then we have our cells. Now the next thing that we're going to do is that we're going to take those cells and we're going to pass it to the index, the IVF, and we're going to say dot lookup, and we're going to look up those cells. So let me do that next. And just to make sure I'm dealing with the right items, let's go back up here. Let's see, get cells, Q, N cells. So cells scores equals searcher dot ranker dot get cells. And okay, good. So we have our values correct. So I'm going to take these cells and I'm going to pass it to this IVF. So if I go here and I say searcher.ranker.ivf, we can see that this IVF is a strided tensor. So there we see strided tensor again. This is one of the core data structures. I don't fully understand it yet, but my understanding is it basically allows you to store information that's jagged in a way where you can get back, a padded version of it. So not a great explanation, but something, that I'll explore for sure in the future. So this is our IVF. This is our inverted file index. And I'm going to run this line of code here. All right, so now if I look at my PIDs, this is now showing me 10 values. And now I have a better understanding, so I can see that, okay, the first two centroids, so 7 and 8, they map to the 0th passage. 14 maps to the first one, or second one. 19 maps to passage ID 0. 24 to passage ID 1, 29, 31, 38 map to passage ID 2. So we can, see in action the mapping from Centroid ID to our passage ID. So I thought that's super cool. I have a longer, more verbose notebook that I'll also put in the video description. And in that, I've gone into more detail about how this IVF is constructed. And I found that really interesting because it also takes into account passage token embeddings. I might do a separate video on that, but the more verbose, meandering, exploratory notebook is linked in the video description. Okay, so I'm going to pause there, and we're almost done with, we're pretty much done with stage 1. But one thing I wanted to do is I just wanted to take a look before we move on. I wanted to look at our index path because there's some really interesting things inside there. So if you look at this, there's 12 different files. So we're going to look at the residuals, we're going to look at some metadata, and so on and so forth. So the first thing I'm going to look at is doclens.0.json. And here we see that there are 13 tokens for each passage. And then there's also a metadata.json. And that further confirms that yes, we have 3 passages and we have 39 embeddings across those passages, one for each token in the passage. They also have the centroid stored in there. And yet another confirmation that yes, indeed, we have 64 centroids, and each of them are 128 dimensions. They also have this mapping that they call codes. And from this, I'm deducing that, okay, there's 39 objects or items in here, and that corresponds to 39 passage token embeddings. The minimum is 0 and the maximum is 61. So I'm pretty sure this is a mapping between our passage token embeddings and our centroid IDs. So important to note that in this pipeline, and we'll see this a bit later on, we are looking at the mapping between passage IDs and centroid IDs, and then we're also looking at the mapping between passage IDs and passage tokens, And then we're also looking at the mapping between Centroid IDs and passage tokens. So all three of these relationships matter as we're going through this pipeline. Okay, cool. So that's enough of a little detour into the index path. Let's keep going through our generate candidates. So we did this here. We did our lookup, it puts it onto the GPU and it returns it. And then here it sorts them, gets the values, and then gets the unique values. So I'm just going to grab, actually I'm just going to grab all this code. And this is going to be searcher.ranker. And this is going to be config. So if I run this, I'll see that here are my unique passage IDs. And there are 5 Centroid IDs that map to passage ID 0, 2 of them to 1, and 3 of them to 2. So I have 10 total Centroids that are the top 4 nearest to each of my 32 query tokens. So that's how I would interpret all of these values. Okay, so let's recap what we've done. We picked a number of Centroid IDs nearest to each query token that we're interested in, and that was this cells value, and which is 4. Then we calculated the cosine similarity between the centroids and the query tokens. And so going back up here, that was this calculation here. Our centroids matrix multiplied with query transposed. So that's our cosine similarity. Then we picked the top 4 scores per query token. And then we grabbed the indices that correspond to the rows, which are Centroid IDs. And then we reduced those down to, or flattened those out into 128. And then we reduced those down to 10 unique ones. So that gives us our cells. We then take those cells, then we look up in our index the mapping between those 10 Centroid IDs and the corresponding passage IDs. And then down here, we sort them and get the unique ones. And at the end of it, we have our 3 unique passage IDs and the scores that go along with it. So that is a recap of stage 1. And these PIDs down here that we see, that is the candidate set that we have generated with stage 1. So that is our initial candidate set. Okay, so that is stage 1. We're now going to look at stage 2, where we want to keep the passage IDs that correspond to centroids that exceed a minimum threshold cosine similarity with query tokens. So I'm going to go back to my rank, and let's see where that was. All right, so here is rank. And yeah, here's my ranker, this indexStorage.py. This is going to be my ranker. And I'm very interested in this score PIDs. So this method, which we're seeing here, is going to be, so here's filter docs using pruned centroid scores. So this is all going to be our stage 2 code. And then filter docs using full centroid scores. This all is going to be our stage 3. And then rank final list of docs using full approximate embeddings. This is going to be, well, really down here, this is all going to be stage 4. So everything happens in our score PIDs function. So let's take a look at that first. Cool. So I do have access with that. All right, so let's just walk through each line that's relevant. And let me move this over here. Okay, so I'm not worried about batches right now, so I'm not going to worry about this line. But up here, this is what I'm interested in. I am taking the Centroid scores and I'm finding the maximum values for across query tokens, and I'm seeing if it's greater than or equal to my score threshold. So let's go back here. I'm going to refresh my query tokens. Okay, good. And then I'm going to get back my Centroid scores and my passage IDs. And I'm going to use my retrieve method. So we have my 3 passage IDs and our 64 by 32 score matrix. Inside our config, we should have a Centroid score threshold, and that's 0.5. So this is something you can set, and the default is 0.5. So now I can just grab this line and then I can take a look at the output. So what I get is a Boolean tensor where, and let's look at the shape real quick. Yeah, so this is 64 values, 1 for each Centroid ID in my scores matrix. And the value is false for the Centroid ID where the maximum value across all 32 query tokens was not greater than the score threshold. And it's true for all of the Centroid IDs where the maximum query token score was greater than or equal to my Centroid score threshold. So this IDX is going to be used to index into things. All right, so the next line of interest is this one right here. So we are looking up our passage IDs in this embeddings underscore strided object, and we're looking up our codes, and we're getting back our codes packed and our codes length. So let's just run this whole thing and take a look at what it outputs. And let's scoot this up here. Okay, so this is really telling of what we're dealing with right now. So this codes underscore packed tensor has 39 objects, and this codes.lengths tensor has 3 objects. And if we look at codes.lengths, or codes underscore lengths, we'll see that it's just 13. So that represents the number of tokens that each passage contains, and this 39 represents the total number of tokens that we're dealing with. And so let me go down here and let's just take a look at codes packed, and we'll see that they're just integers. These are just integer values that correspond to Centroid IDs. So what we're seeing here with lookup is that we're looking up with our passage IDs of 0, 1, and 2, we're looking up the Centroids that are associated with those passages token embeddings. And this I found to be related with section 4.2 in the paper where they're talking about Centroid interaction. And they say the procedure works as follows. Recall that S from equation 2 stores the relevant scores for each Centroid with respect to the query tokens. Suppose I is the list of Centroid indices mapped to each of the tokens in the candidate set. Furthermore, let si, if we go down here, denote the ith row of s. Then PLAID constructs the Centroid-based approximate scores as follows. So the key thing that I wanted to highlight in this is that we have this mapping from Centroid indices to each of the tokens. And my interpretation of this code is that we're kind of utilizing that mapping between our 39 passage token embeddings and our 64 Centroid IDs. Okay. Cool. So moving on into the code, we're now going to pick those rows from IDX that correspond to these 39 values. So if I look at IDX shape, I have now picked out from my 64 Centroid IDs that were Booleans of true or false. I have picked out those Centroid IDs that correspond to these 39 passage token embeddings. Okay, we're going to come back to this in a second because that's more relevant to the maxim operation. But I'm going to skip to this line where we're now using our index, our Boolean tensor, and then we're picking out only those values where IDX is true. So there are 14 Centroid IDs that correspond to the 39 passage token embeddings such that their maximum cosine similarity with the query tokens is at or above our threshold. So these are our Centroid ID candidates that pass our threshold. And if we look at this tensor, we'll see it's just a bunch of integers. Okay, cool. Going back to the code, I'm going to then use those Centroid IDs to index into my Centroid scores. So I want the scores from the 41st row, the 8th row, the 61st row, so on and so forth. So this is 14, which is the number of Centroids that I'm dealing with, by 32, which is the number of query tokens I have. So now we have the scores between our candidate Centroid IDs and all of our query tokens. All right, so the last step of stage 2 is to max reduce the scores down to 1 per passage. And it's going to require 6 lines of code, and we're going to walk through those next. So I'm going to run this import statement because I want to be able to access the strided tensor. And we're going to go back to the code here, and we're going to grab this line where it says prunes, codes, strided. Or pruned code strided. And that's not going to be as informative. All it's going to show is that, yes, this is a strided tensor. But the next ones are interesting. So I'm going to grab these 2 lines, or let me just grab this line. So this is accessing the as padded tensor method of a strided tensor. And so this is interesting because now we can see that it has organized these codes, which was our index value, the one that was let's make sure I'm looking at the right one. Yeah, the one with 39 true or false values. And it's reshaped that. So now I have 3 groups of 13 tokens. And this is important because now we've organized it in a way where we can max reduce it by passage ID. So if we look at this pruned codes padded, we'll see that it's 3 groups, and each group has 13 values. So yeah, my understanding of strided tensor is still spotty, but I can see that, okay, at least it allows this reshaping of values from 1D 39 elements to a 3 by 13 tensor. The next line that I'm gonna run is this here. So I'm gonna get these prune code lengths. And this is small enough that we can just look at it. So this is taking our pruned codes padded, and it's multiplying it by our pruned codes mask. This mask is not very interesting. It's just 39 or 3 by 13 of true values. So this multiplication here just keeps all the values of pruned codes padded. And then it's summing across the second dimension, which is the 13 passage tokens in each passage, and it's giving us a final result. So how I interpret this value at this 824 is that there are 8 centroids corresponding to tokens in the first passage that were at or above our threshold, score threshold. And there are 2 such centroids for the second passage and 4 such centroids for the third passage. All right, so we can go back here. We already did this and we already did this. We don't need to append because we're not doing batches. So what I'm going to grab is I'm going to grab these 2 lines, which does pretty much what we did here with our IDX, we're going to do with our approximate scores. Okay, cool. So what's interesting to note here is that this shape is 3 by 8. And we know that there are 8 centroids for the first passage, and there were 2 centroids for the second and 4 for the third. But what this has done is that it has basically padded out those values. So I have 3 passage IDs, and then I have up to a maximum of 8 centroid IDs that correspond to that. And a really insightful way to look at this was this approx scores max. And we see this as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 2, 4, 6, 8, and then 2, 4, 6, 8. So all of these have 8 values. All are true for the first passage because we saw up here that there were 8 centroid IDs. Only 2 are true for the second passage because there's only 2 centroid IDs. And then only 4 are true for the third passage because there's 4 valid centroid IDs. So in this way, you know, this is like introducing padding and in our reshaped tensor, because this is now going to allow us to max reduce based on the passages. And we're going to do that next. And let me copy over our imports. So again, RAGatouille installs Colbert and everything for you, so you can just run this after installing RAGatouille. And we're going to use these different scoring functions in stages 2 and 3. So I go back to my code, and we are moving right along. And here is the line where the actual scoring, the maxim operation takes place. So I'm going to run this and take a look at the output. And this should be searcher.config. And great. So I get 3 values now, 1 for each passage. You'll notice that these are not the same values as my RAGatouille results because we're still in an intermediate stage, right? We're still in stage 2. It won't be until after stage 4 where we'll get these exact values. But we can see, like, okay, we're getting close, right? These are approximate values, but they're getting close. So the thing that I want to look at now, before we move on, is I want to look at this Colbert score reduce function, because I found that to be really enlightening about how maxim works. So that's inside modeling/colbert.py. And the really interesting lines are this one, where we take the max similarity, and then here's the summation across query tokens, so we get one value per passage. So I'm going to grab this code so we can look at the shapes of things. And just to show here, scores padded was our first argument to Colbert score reduce, and this dmask was our second argument. So scores padded is this. And dmask is this. So if I run this, I should see that my scores are now reshaped into 3 by 38 by 32. So I have 3 passages, up to 8 tokens in each passage that are corresponding to my centroids. So I should really say there's up to 8 centroids, and there's 32 query tokens that we are dealing with. Okay, so that's that line. The next line of interest is here. And looking at the shape is really enlightening because we can see that this max 1 is happening on this dimension. And what we end up with is that for each of the 3 passages, we end up with the cosine similarity, which was between centroids and query tokens. That is the maximum across up to the 8 centroids that were in consideration for our passages. So here we have 3 by 32 as our shape. And I found that to be really enlightening in helping me understand how maxsim works. And then I'm going to ignore this business here, and I'm going to skip to scores.sum. And so here we can, literally we can see that, okay, we are summing across all query tokens for each passage. So what we get is that we get a token level score that is now aggregated up to a passage. And so far we've only dealt with centroid IDs. And these were the 3 values that we saw up here. Okay, so the last step in stage 2 is that we have to pick the top k values, where top k is ndocs. And ndocs is very large relative to our toy example. So it's 256. So we're not really going to have to worry about that. But let me run this code nonetheless. And approx scores, let me see, I think it's this one. So we run that, but what we're really interested in is that, just for the sake of our example, I'm going to run top k on our scores, except I'm just going to use a value of 3. And we're going to grab those indices. And so 0 to 1 is the ordering that we're interested in. And that corresponds to 0, 2, and 1. Okay, so let's recap stage 2. We selected centroid IDs that were both at or above our threshold of 0.5 and corresponded to passage tokens for the passage IDs in our initial candidate pool from stage 1. Then we did some reshaping so that we could calculate the maxim relevance score for each passage ID. And then we picked the top K passages where in the paper and by default, it'll pick the top 256 passage IDs. In my toy example, it picks the top 3, which are the 3 documents we're dealing with. So that covers stage 2. Stage 3 is really similar because it does much of the same things. It just doesn't do all this Centroid score threshold business. So this is Centroid interaction without pruning. So I'm going to scroll down here. So this is stage 3. Yeah, so we'll see here that now we're using all Centroid IDs in question. So we're using all 39. Earlier up here, if I can find it, we had only 14 that we were dealing with because we had only looked at those that were above our threshold of 0.5. Cool. So we can keep moving along, and we're going to grab our approximate scores. And this is 39 by 32, 39 Centroid IDs corresponding to the 39 passage tokens in our data set or in our collection. And then we're going to grab all this business, which is the same as before. So we're making a strided tensor. We're getting back a padded tensor, and then we're getting our scores from Colbert score reduce, which we looked at. And now we'll see that here, just kind of comparing with the previous, so 2812, 9844, 1719. So we get slightly different values now. It's not quite the same as our RAGatouille because we still have one more stage, but we're kind of getting closer and closer to those. And then if I look at my PIDs, these are not going to change, but looking at the code, we would also run this top K value, except now in stage 3, the top K value is ndocs over 4. So by default, that's going to be 256 over 4, which is 64. So it'll be down to 64 passage IDs. In our case, we just have 3, so we're just going to keep the 3 that are in play. And that's it for stage 3. So this is the candidate set at the end of stage 3, and these are the scores that go with it. And the final stage is stage 4. And this is down here, rank final list of docs using full approximate embeddings. And we are using our GPU, so we're going to grab this line of code. So we look up our passage IDs, and we get back our passage token embeddings. So if I scroll up here, and if we look at, where is that wonderful diagram? Here we go. Yeah, so here we are looking at our passage embeddings, and then we're going to look at our interaction between the actual passages in our documents with the query tokens. Whereas in stages 1 through 3, we were in that Centroid space where we were only looking at Centroid interaction with our query tokens. Okay, cool. And just looking at these values, so if we look at our dpact, look at the first few values, and we'll see, yeah, we just have a bunch of floats. All right, so that is this step. We don't have to do this because we're not on a CPU. We do have a query size, a batch size of 1. So this is what we're going to use. So let's just look at that. And that is 1. So we're going to now do this. Cool. And now you'll see that this is now our actual values that we had in our RAGatouille results, right? So 27.6875, 22.28125. We don't have that trailing 5, but 13.953125, 13.9531, and then our passage IDs were 0, 2, and 1. So at this point, I was feeling like, okay, we've walked through all 4 stages. We're getting the right answer. I'm pretty certain that this is correct, right? Like this feels really good. I've been able to touch every part of the pipeline. One thing that I want to look at is our Colbert score packed, because that's a different one than the Colbert score reduced that we were working with. So this works with a single query only, and it has Q, dpacked, and D lengths. So if we go back here, Q, dpacked, and then dmask is our D lengths. It does this here, so it squeezes our queries. So that should get rid of the unit axis at the front, which it does. And then this is, very much of interest. So let's make sure that I can just use it. Yeah, so this is dpacked, and then I think that's good to go. So this is going to give us a score between every single passage token and every single query token. So this is 39 passage tokens by 32 query tokens. So if we look back here, this is what we're talking about here in terms of true relevance scores. This stuff doesn't matter here. Well, actually, no, we are using GPUs, so I'm going to grab this. I'm actually going to grab both of these. And D lengths is what they call it, but it's actually our D mask. And here we have it. So we have 3 passages. Each one has up to 13 passage tokens, and we have 32 are query tokens. We looked at Colbert score reduce above, so I'm just going to run that, and it should hopefully give us our final results. And yes, that looks good. So yeah, to recap stage 4, we looked up the full vectors, the full encodings, corresponding to all passage tokens related to our passage IDs. We reshaped them to allow for max reducing by passage ID. Then we calculated this maxim score for each passage using Colbert score reduce. And then we get back our score and we get back our passage IDs. And in this way, we're able to recreate the entire 4-stage PLAID scoring pipeline to match the RAGatouille results. So hopefully that was interesting to you all. I'm going to post this notebook. I'm also going to post my initial exploratory notebook, which is very verbose and very meandering, but is kind of giving you the raw insight into how I was navigating this entire code base. I also have some extra tidbits in there related to how the IVF is constructed. and also looking at the mapping between embeddings and Centroid IDs. So I'll post both of these notebooks up there. And yeah, I expect to do a lot more Colbert content, definitely a lot more information retrieval content. So thanks for sticking around until the end, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.